Isaac Newton, an outstanding English scientist who laid the foundations of classical mechanics, physics, and mathematics, is known to almost everyone today. But few people realize that he was also a very knowledgeable alchemist. In the 20th century, Newton's personal manuscripts were deciphered. As it turned out, the famous rationalist, who called for thinking coldly and without prejudice, was a heretic, looking for the secret of the philosopher's stone, and also deciphering the Bible. Sir Newton is known as the scientist who created mechanics, but it turns out that this is only one aspect of his rich inner world. Like many people of his time, he had varied interests, including optics, mathematics, and it appears that he had an interest in the theology of alchemy and mysticism. As part of a project to translate Newton's articles, his works on theology appeared on the Internet, which are stored in the National Library in Jerusalem. Newton was a religious man who was heavily involved in theology and biblical studies. It turns out that most of his articles were devoted to religious topics and not scientific ones. In his writings, he raised the problem of gravity, where he explains the movement of the planets and that he cannot explain who made them move. So what secrets are hidden behind the facade of a famous scientist, or is there something more that we simply weren't told about? That's what we'll talk about today. But this doesn't remind you of anything, because Newton, being a scientist, propagated to everyone a rational, cold, analytical approach to everything, while he himself was secretly interested in occult sciences and knowledge. Speaking of the movement of celestial bodies, Newton said that in his opinion only God can explain everything. He knows everything that is happening and what is going to happen. Strangely enough, this rationalist, confident for the majority of the public, believed in God. And this faith prompted him to study the laws of nature in order to understand the highest wisdom of the Creator. So you understand what this means. Today, most scientists are, as it were, skeptics for us, and in secret coolers they are engaged in research that is related to the occult and other secret sciences, which of course are not reported to us. So, as a religious man, Newton believed that sacred secrets were hidden in the structures of ancient temples. For 50 years, he studied in depth the structure of many temples. Among them are the temples of Greece, but especially the first temple of King Solomon. He was sure that not only there was a hidden meaning in the works of ancient philosophers and scientists, but also in the architecture of ancient temples. Using the known descriptions of the temple presented in the Book of Kings, which he himself translated from Hebrew, as well as with the help of other studies on the structure of temples of the period, Newton presented a sketch and description of the first temple. His work contains a detailed description of the architectural design, including the dimensions of the buildings and the number of steps in its different compartments. As a scientist, Newton was interested in sacred geometry, used in the construction of King Solomon's temple, as well as spirals of the golden ratio, that is, in divine proportion, as a harmonious relationship between different lengths, which is widely observed in nature, art, and architecture. To do this, Newton studied the architecture of temples in detail. The scientist came to the conclusion that the designer of the temple was King Solomon himself, who received the help of heaven. He wrote that this philosophy can be found not only in nature, but also in the sacred scriptures. Solomon's story had a connection with God, and thanks to his deep knowledge, he turned into the greatest philosopher in the world. In his scientific research, Newton was interested in Kabbalah and the Talmud. Newton spent a lot of time studying the course of history, compiling chronologies of ancient kingdoms, published a year after his death. The book is mainly devoted to the history of Greece, Egypt, and the Levante region. In addition, Newton began to deeply study the period preceding Christianity. When he was researching very ancient times, he became interested in a place in England called Stonehenge, where there were two circles of large stones surrounding a common center in which there was a torch. Although today there is a version that Stonehenge is a remake and was built not so long ago. Similar ancient sites, where stones are arranged around a central fire, have been found all over the world, including Denmark, Persia, Ireland, China, and so on. Newton concluded from these facts that all these places were in ancient times round temples of some ancient religion. Beginning in 1668, Newton devoted 25 years of his life to the secret science of alchemy, which he was selflessly passionate about. Just like other alchemists, he was busy searching for the philosopher's stone, a mythical ingredient that turns any metal into gold. Newton became one of Europe's leading alchemists. He did not do this in order to get rich. Experiments became for him a means of comprehending God's secrets, unraveling the mysteries of creation. Alchemy was supposed to help him discover the laws of the universe. Newton believed that God transmitted knowledge to people, encrypted in ancient writings, temples, myths, and alchemical literature. He believed that alchemy was capable of revealing the secrets of the universe, which one only needed to learn to decipher. He considered himself the chosen one, called to unravel the mysteries hidden in the Bible. He researched the history of religion and unexpectedly came to the conclusion that the Catholic and Anglican churches were based on a distortion of biblical tenets. Newton diligently studied biblical texts. He had 30 Bibles in different languages of the world. Newton tried to find encrypted descriptions of the past and future in them and, based on his own calculations, tried to uncover the secret of the end of the world. The scientist entered the history of science and culture primarily as the founder of classical physical knowledge. However, his contemporaries highly valued his theological writings. So the famous English philosopher John Locke wrote to his nephew King in 1703. Newton is truly a remarkable scientist, not only because of his amazing achievements in mathematics, but also in theology due to his great knowledge of the sacred scriptures, in which few can equal him. In wide circles, Newton's fame as a theologian was very great. What appears to us today as a strange combination of a learned mathematician and a theologian was the norm for the scientific hierarchy in the 17th centuries. Especially in England, where broad knowledge in the natural and theological sciences could be a good help in a political career. Newton's Protestantism and Arianism were one of the forms of struggle with the Catholic stewards, with the Tory party. The same political roots can be traced in almost all of Newton's theological works. According to the last fragment of the fundamental work of the mathematical beginnings of natural philosophy, Newton directly writes, "Reasoning about God on the basis of occurring phenomena, of course, relates to the subject of natural philosophy. Their satellite planets, once set in motion by a mysterious first shock, continued to circle in their destined ellipses forever and ever, or at least until the end of all things." Newton's initial conditions subsequently formed the basis of later arguments in favor of the existence of God, and gradually the news of the versatile English genius spread throughout Europe. In 1698, the Russian Tsar Peter the Great, arriving in London as part of his great embassy, was most eager to meet Isaac Newton. Newton respectfully agreed to such a meeting and even considered the inventive and practical Russian Tsar to be a much more knowledgeable interlocutor in science than the monarch of his own country. As we know, friends, there is also a hypothesis that Peter the Great was replaced on this trip. In the same year, Newton received the position of manager of the Mint. He remained in this post until his death. Control over public finances was undoubtedly a lucrative business, and therefore Newton became a very wealthy person, which allowed him to fully concentrate on scientific research, even to the detriment of his academic university career. But the path of a leader was by no means alien to the researcher. In 1703, he was elected president of the Royal Scientific Society, which was then not in the best position, being on the verge of bankruptcy. Before Newton, this post was traditionally occupied by aristocrats who perceived their position as more like a sinecure, and then they cared little about the fate of the enterprise. Over the many years leading the society, he attended almost all of its meetings and even chaired them, summing up the discussions from a particularly representative chair installed at the head of the table. Being a very religious person, though not quite in the traditional sense of the word, Newton did not remain indifferent to esotericism and alchemy. So he makes friends with the French Protestant exile Jean de Séguier, one of the key figures in European Freemasonry. Esoteric traditions were partially borrowed by Freemasonry from the medieval guild brotherhoods of mason builders. And partly they came from medieval knightly orders. It is not known for certain whether Newton was a Freemason, but his membership in an educational society is certain, which held informal meetings and discussions about ancient antiquities over a cup of coffee. In addition, it is known that Newton shared the classic alchemical allegory about Jason's journey for the golden fleece. And now, perhaps the most important thing, friends. Considering that Freemasonry and all secret societies are really connected with Satanism, it's just that all this is carefully hidden from the public and masked by a pseudo-scientific screen. Isaac Newton revealed the secret of his double life only at the age of 84 on his deathbed. He told his friends about his heretical views and refused his final confession. After his death, 169 books on alchemy were found in the library. His archives remained unknown for a long time. It was not until 1936 that they were sold at auction. They were purchased by John Maynard Keynes. And after deciphering them, he published an article entitled The Other Newton, which created a real sensation, revealing the truth about the scientist as an alchemist, mystic, and theologian. What does this tell us? Despite the fact that Newton hid behind the faith of God, he still communicated with magicians, alchemists, sorcerers, masons, and other dark elements of the world. And the very fact that the Bible completely prohibits various dark arts, including astrology, magic, the occult, Newton still practiced these forbidden things. Double standards. That's right, that's absolutely true. Well, as we see, behind all major scientists and famous figures there is a clearly defined force.